Officer Thomas Reed was having one of those days, the kind where nothing seemed to go right. His coffee had spilled on his uniform that morning. He'd gotten a call from his landlord about a rent increase, and to top it all off, it was raining. Not the gentle kind, but the sort that soaked you to the bone within seconds. Yet all of that faded from his mind the moment he walked into Riverside Cafe and saw her. She sat by the window, raindrops racing down the glass beside her, a book open in front of her and a steaming cup of something that smelled like cinnamon nearby. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and even from across the room, Thomas could tell she had the kind of smile that lit up her whole face when she turned to thank the barista. Thomas wasn't typically the kind of guy who approached women while in uniform. He believed in keeping his personal life separate from his professional one. But there was something about her that made him break his own rule. He ordered his coffee, straightened his badge, and walked over to her table. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, putting on his most charming smile. "All the other tables are taken." The woman, whose name he would later learn was Catherine Chen, looked up from her book. Her eyes, a warm brown that reminded Thomas of autumn, quickly scanned the cafe. There were at least 3 empty tables. "I'm actually waiting for someone," she said with a polite smile. "Sorry." Thomas nodded, trying not to show his disappointment. "No problem. Have a good day, ma'am." He retreated to one of the empty tables and sipped his coffee, occasionally glancing in her direction. No one joined her table. After 20 minutes, Thomas decided to try again. "Looks like your friend stood you up," he said, approaching her once more. "I'm Thomas, by the way." Catherine closed her book. "They must be running late," she said. Her tone was still polite but noticeably cooler. "Well, their loss could be my gain," Thomas pressed on. "I'm about to go off duty. Maybe we could grab dinner somewhere." Catherine's smile didn't reach her eyes this time. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested." Thomas felt his face grow hot. He wasn't used to rejection, especially not twice in one day from the same person. "Come on, just one dinner." "What's the harm?" "I said no, thank you." Catherine's voice was firm now, her attention returning to her book in a clear dismissal. "You don't have to be rude about it," Thomas muttered, loud enough for her to hear as he walked away. For the next few days, Thomas couldn't get Catherine out of his mind. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she certainly was. It was the way she'd said no, so confident, so final, like she didn't care who he was or what he could offer. It bothered him more than it should have. When he spotted her again the following week walking out of the public library, Thomas told himself it was just chance. He hadn't been looking for her. Hadn't been taking his patrol car past the cafe every day hoping to see her. That would be silly, unprofessional even. Afternoon, he called from his police car. Catherine looked up, recognition and something like wariness crossing her face. "Officer?" she acknowledged with a small nod before continuing on her way. Thomas frowned. He pulled his car alongside her as she walked. "I don't think I ever got your name." "That's because I didn't give it," she replied without breaking stride. "You know, most people are a bit more respectful when talking to an officer of the law," Thomas said, a hint of authority creeping into his voice. That made Catherine stop. She turned to face him fully. "I've been perfectly respectful, officer. I've also been clear that I'm not interested in a personal conversation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have somewhere to be." Thomas watched her walk away, frustration building in his chest. Who did she think she was? He was Officer Thomas Reed, 3-time recipient of the department's Merit Award. He was respected, admired even, and she was treating him like he was nothing. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas found himself noticing Catherine around town more and more. She seemed to be everywhere: the grocery store, the park, the local bookshop. He told himself it was a small town, that it made sense their paths would cross. But deep down, he knew he was looking for her. Each time he would make a point to say hello. Each time she would respond with minimal politeness before finding a reason to move on. And each time the rejection stung a little more. "You know that woman who's always at Riverside Cafe?" Thomas asked his partner, Officer Diaz, one day while on patrol. "The one with the books?" "Yeah, I've seen her around," Diaz replied. "Why?" Thomas shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Just wondering if you knew anything about her." Diaz gave him a knowing look. "Don't tell me you're interested in her." "She's way out of your league, Reed." "What makes you say that?" Thomas asked, gripping the steering wheel a bit tighter. "Well, for one thing, she's clearly got brains, always reading those big books. And for another, I hear she just moved here for some fancy job with the government. Legal department or something. Thomas said nothing, but the information only added to his fascination. A smart, beautiful woman with a government job. Why wouldn't she want to go out with a respected police officer? It was a rainy Tuesday when things finally came to a head. Thomas was driving back to the station after his shift when he spotted Catherine crossing Main Street. The light was red for pedestrians, but the street was empty and she was clearly in a hurry, clutching her jacket close against the rain. Thomas flipped on his lights and pulled over. Catherine stopped on the sidewalk, confusion evident on her face as Thomas stepped out of his patrol car. "Ma'am, did you realize you just jaywalked?" he asked, approaching her with his citation book already in hand. "Excuse me?" Catherine looked around at the empty street. There were no cars coming. That doesn't matter. The pedestrian signal was red. "It's a safety violation." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "Officer Reed, isn't this a bit excessive? I've never seen anyone get ticketed for crossing an empty street." "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," Thomas said, though even he could hear how hollow the word sounded. "I'll need to see some ID." "This is ridiculous," Catherine muttered, but she reached into her purse and handed him her driver's license. Thomas took his time examining it. Catherine Chen, 29 years old, recently moved from Washington, D.C. He jotted down her information with deliberate slowness. "You know," he said, not looking up from his notepad, "I could probably let this go with just a warning." "Could you?" Catherine's voice was cool. "Sure, maybe we could discuss it over coffee sometime." There was a long pause, broken only by the sound of rain hitting the pavement. When Catherine spoke, her voice was low and measured. "Are you suggesting that you'll drop this citation if I agree to go out with you?" Thomas finally looked up. "I'm just saying we could be friendlier to each other. No reason for things to be difficult." Catherine held out her hand. "I'll take my ID back, please." "Look, I'm trying to be nice here." "No, you're trying to abuse your position to pressure me into a date. I'd like my ID back, and then I'd like you to leave me alone." Thomas felt a flush of anger rising up his neck. Who did she think she was talking to? "You know what? I think we need to have a conversation about respecting authority. Why don't you come down to the station with me?" "On what charges?" Catherine demanded, her voice rising slightly. "Jaywalking, for starters, and now I'm concerned about your attitude toward law enforcement. Could be seen as disorderly conduct." "This is absurd," Catherine said, disbelief evident in her voice. "You can't arrest someone for refusing to date you." Thomas stepped closer. "I'm not arresting you for that. I'm bringing you in for jaywalking and showing disrespect to an officer. Now, are you going to come quietly, or do I need to add resisting arrest to the list?" Rain streamed down Catherine's face, but her gaze didn't waver. "Fine," she said after a moment. "But I want it on record that I'm complying under protest, and I want to call my lawyer as soon as we reach the station." "Whatever you say, Miss Chen," Thomas replied, feeling a surge of satisfaction as he guided her toward his patrol car. He had no idea that this small act of pettiness, born from wounded pride and misplaced entitlement, was about to change his life forever, and not in the way he had hoped. As he closed the door on Catherine's stoic figure in the back seat, Thomas couldn't have known that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. He couldn't have known who Catherine really was, or who her family was, or what would happen once they found out about his actions. All he knew was that finally he had her attention. The ride to the police station was silent. Catherine sat in the back of the patrol car, her face a mask of calm that only occasionally slipped to reveal the anger underneath. Thomas glanced at her in the rearview mirror more times than necessary, a part of him already wondering if he'd gone too far. But another part, the part bruised by her repeated rejections, felt vindicated. Rain drummed against the roof of the car as they pulled into the station's parking lot. The building was small by city standards, just a single-story brick structure with the town's flag hanging limp and wet beside the entrance. "Watch your head," Thomas said automatically as he helped Catherine out of the car, his hand gripping her elbow a little tighter than needed. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everyone in an unflattering glow. A few officers looked up from their desks, curiosity in their eyes. It wasn't every day that Thomas Reed brought someone in, especially not someone like Catherine. Officer Diaz approached them, coffee mug in hand. "What do we have here, Reed?" "Jaywalking and disorderly conduct," Thomas replied, guiding Catherine toward the processing desk. Diaz raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? For jaywalking?" Thomas felt a flicker of embarrassment but pushed it down. She was disrespectful when I tried to issue a warning. Catherine's eyes met Diaz's. I declined his dinner invitation. Apparently that's a crime now. Diaz's expression shifted from surprise to concern. He pulled Thomas aside, lowering his voice. Reed, what are you doing? You can't bring someone in for this. I can if they disrespect an officer, Thomas insisted, though his conviction was beginning to waver. This isn't right, and you know it, Diaz said. The chief's going to have your badge if... The chief's not here, Thomas cut him off. And I'm just following procedure. Diaz shook his head but stepped back, clearly not wanting to create a scene. Thomas guided Catherine to the processing desk, where a tired-looking clerk named Donna waited. Name? Donna asked, fingers hovering over her keyboard. Catherine Chen, Catherine replied, her voice steady. Address? 1842 Parkview Lane, apartment 3B. Donna's fingers clacked against the keys. Reason for arrest? Before Thomas could answer, Catherine spoke up. Wounded male ego. Donna's typing paused as she looked up, her eyes moving from Catherine to Thomas and back again. Jaywalking and disorderly conduct, Thomas corrected, his face growing hot. Donna nodded slowly, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to challenge him. Right. I'll need your personal belongings, Miss Chen. Catherine handed over her purse, watch, and a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant. As Donna catalogued each item, Catherine kept her eyes fixed on Thomas. I want my phone call, she said. Thomas nodded. You'll get it after processing. The next 20 minutes were filled with the mundane bureaucracy of the justice system. Fingerprints, a mugshot, during which Catherine stared directly into the camera without flinching, and a series of standard questions about health conditions and emergency contacts. Throughout it all, Catherine remained composed, answering each question with a detached politeness that somehow made Thomas feel smaller with each passing moment. The righteous anger that had fueled him earlier was fading, leaving behind an uncomfortable awareness that he might have made a terrible mistake. Finally, Catherine was led to a small room with a phone mounted on the wall. You have 5 minutes, Thomas told her, trying to maintain some semblance of authority. Catherine picked up the receiver, her back straight and her expression unreadable. She dialed a number from memory and waited. Thomas stood by the door, close enough to hear her side of the conversation, but trying to appear as if he wasn't listening. Hi, it's me, Catherine said when someone answered. Her voice was calm, controlled. I need you to come to the Riverside police station. No, I'm fine. I was arrested for jaywalking and, quote, disorderly conduct. Yes, really? No, don't do that. Just come down here. And Dad, wear the uniform. Thomas felt a chill run through him at those last words. Uniform? Who exactly had she called? After hanging up, Catherine turned to Thomas. My father will be here shortly. Great, Thomas said, trying to sound unconcerned. You can wait in the holding cell until then. The holding cell was little more than a glorified cage, 3 concrete walls and a set of bars facing the main office area. There was a bench along one wall and not much else. Catherine sat down, her posture still perfect, and fixed her gaze on the wall opposite her. Thomas retreated to his desk but found it hard to focus on anything. Officer Diaz kept shooting him disapproving looks, and even Donna seemed to be avoiding his eyes. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the sudden quiet of the station. An hour passed. Thomas was just starting to relax, thinking perhaps Catherine's mysterious father wouldn't show up after all, when the station door swung open with enough force to hit the wall behind it. A man in an impeccably pressed military uniform strode in, water droplets flying from his coat. The 3 stars on his shoulders gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the ribbons and medals across his chest told a story of decades of distinguished service. Behind him came Police Chief Wilson, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world at that moment. The military man, clearly a lieutenant general from his insignia, scanned the room with sharp eyes that missed nothing. When they landed on Thomas, they narrowed dangerously. Where is my daughter? The general's voice filled the room, quiet but with an authority that made everyone sit up straighter. Thomas stood, his mouth suddenly dry. Sir, if you're referring to Catherine Chen, Lieutenant General Robert Chen, United States Army, the man cut him off. And yes, I'm referring to my daughter, who I understand has been arrested for crossing the street and hurting your feelings. A few officers stifled gasps or coughs. Chief Wilson's face had turned a shade of red that Thomas had never seen before. "Sir, she was jaywalking and then became confrontational when you asked her out, and she said no," General Chen finished for him. His voice was dangerously calm. "Yes, she told me about your previous encounters on the phone. Now, where is she?" Thomas gestured weakly toward the holding cell. General Chen strode across the room, Chief Wilson trailing behind him like a storm cloud. Catherine stood as they approached. For the first time since her arrest, emotion broke through her calm exterior. Relief at seeing her father, followed quickly by embarrassment at being seen in such a situation. "Dad," she said softly. "Are you all right?" General Chen asked, his voice gentler than it had been moments before. Catherine nodded. "Just annoyed and a bit damp." Chief Wilson fumbled with his keys, quickly unlocking the cell door. "Miss Chen, please accept my deepest apologies for this misunderstanding. You're free to go, of course." Catherine stepped out of the cell, smoothing down her still wet clothes. "Thank you, Chief Wilson. I appreciate your prompt action, though I would have appreciated it more an hour ago." Chief Wilson winced. "Your belongings will be returned immediately, and I assure you this incident will be thoroughly investigated." "I should hope so," General Chen said, turning his attention back to Thomas, who felt like he was shrinking under that gaze. "Officer Reed, isn't it?" Thomas swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. We'll be having a longer conversation about this, Officer Reed, but not today. Today I'm taking my daughter home." As they turned to leave, Catherine paused beside Thomas. Her voice was low, meant only for him. "You know what the funny thing is? If you had just accepted my no the first time and been a decent human being afterward, I might have changed my mind eventually." "People can surprise you," she shook her head, "but now we'll never know." Thomas watched as Catherine walked out with her father and Chief Wilson, the weight of what he'd done finally sinking in. He'd abused his position, violated someone's rights, and potentially ruined his career, all because he couldn't handle rejection. Around him, the station had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. Officer Diaz approached, his face a mixture of sympathy and disappointment. "You really messed up, Reed," he said quietly. Thomas couldn't argue with that. He sank into his chair, already knowing that the worst was yet to come. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but darker clouds were gathering on the horizon. The morning after Catherine's arrest, Thomas arrived at the station to find Chief Wilson waiting for him. The chief's face was grim, his office door open in a silent summons. Thomas had barely slept, his mind replaying yesterday's events on an endless loop. He knew this conversation wouldn't be pleasant. "Sit down, Reed," Chief Wilson said as Thomas entered the office. He didn't offer coffee like he usually did. Thomas sat, hands resting awkwardly on his knees. The office felt smaller today, the walls closer, the air thicker. "I've been chief in this town for 15 years, Wilson began, his voice low and controlled. "In that time I've dealt with drunk officers, lazy officers, even corrupt officers. But I've never," he leaned forward, eyes locked on Thomas, "never had to deal with what you did yesterday." Thomas opened his mouth to defend himself, but found no words coming out. "Do you have any idea who Catherine Chen is?" "Besides being General Chen's daughter?" Thomas shook his head. "She's a military lawyer with the Judge Advocate General's Corps, a captain. She graduated top of her class at Georgetown Law and has prosecuted cases that have made national headlines." Wilson's fingers drummed against his desk. "And you arrested her for jaywalking because she wouldn't go to dinner with you." Put like that, Thomas's actions sounded even worse than he'd feared. "Chief, I'm not finished," Wilson cut him off. "General Chen is not just any general. He oversees the entire military installation that employs half this town. He's friends with the governor, with senators, with people who could shut this department down with one phone call." The chief stood up, pacing behind his desk. "But forget all that for a moment. Even if Catherine Chen was a nobody with no connections, what you did would still be an abuse of power. It would still be wrong." Thomas stared at the floor, shame burning in his chest. "I've already received formal complaints from both Catherine and her father. Internal Affairs will be conducting a full investigation." Wilson stopped pacing. "Until then, you're suspended without pay." Thomas looked up, panic rising in his throat. "Chief, please." "Your badge and gun, Reed. Now." With shaking hands, Thomas removed his badge and placed it on the desk, followed by his service weapon. They made a dull sound against the wood, a finality to it that made his stomach sink. "I suggest you get a lawyer," Wilson said, his voice softer now but no less serious. "This isn't going to go away." Thomas left the station in a daze, aware of the eyes of his fellow officers following him out. Some held pity, others judgment. Officer Diaz gave him a small nod that might have been encouragement or might have been goodbye. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, interviews, and sleepless nights. The internal affairs investigation was thorough and unforgiving. They reviewed Thomas's body camera footage, interviewed witnesses from the cafe where he'd first approached Catherine, and collected statements from everyone at the station who had been present during the arrest. The evidence was damning. Not only had Thomas clearly abused his authority in arresting Catherine, but the investigation also uncovered a pattern of similar behavior. Not arrests, but incidents where Thomas had used his position to intimidate or impress women. Nothing that had risen to the level of discipline before, but concerning when viewed as a whole. On a rainy Thursday, exactly 1 month after Catherine's arrest, Thomas sat in a conference room at the municipal building, waiting for the disciplinary board's decision. His lawyer, a public defender named Patel, who seemed too young and too tired for this case, had warned him to expect the worst. "Officer Reed," the head of the board said, sliding a document across the table. "We've reached our decision." Thomas picked up the paper with numb fingers. He didn't need to read beyond the first paragraph to know his career in law enforcement was over. Terminated for conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of authority, false arrest, and harassment. "You have the right to appeal," the woman continued, though her tone suggested it would be futile. "But given the evidence and your own testimony, I wouldn't recommend it." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. He'd admitted to everything during the investigation, partly because denying it would have been pointless with all the evidence, and partly because somewhere along the way, he'd finally recognized how wrong his actions had been. As he left the municipal building, Thomas spotted a familiar figure standing under the awning of a nearby cafe, sheltering from the light drizzle. General Chen, in civilian clothes this time, was watching him. Thomas hesitated, then walked over, stopping at a respectful distance. "Sir," he said, not sure what else to say. "Reed," General Chen acknowledged. "I heard today was your hearing." Thomas nodded. "I've been terminated." "Good." The blunt response stung, but Thomas couldn't argue with it. "I know it doesn't mean much, but I'm sorry for what I did to your daughter." General Chen studied him for a long moment. "You're right. It doesn't mean much to me." He took a sip from his coffee cup. "But Catherine said something interesting the other day. She said she thought you might actually learn from this, which is more than she can say for most men who abuse their power." Thomas blinked in surprise. "She said that?" "She did. My daughter has a remarkable capacity for seeing the potential for growth in people, even those who've wronged her." General Chen's eyes hardened. "I don't share that quality. If it were up to me, you'd be facing criminal charges. Why aren't I? Because Catherine believes the loss of your career and the public humiliation are punishment enough." General Chen shook his head. "She's more forgiving than I am." Thomas looked down at the wet pavement. "I don't deserve her forgiveness." "No, you don't," General Chen agreed. "But that's the thing about forgiveness. It's not about what you deserve. It's about allowing people the chance to be better than they were." He finished his coffee and tossed the cup into a nearby trash can. "Don't waste this chance, Reed." With that, the general walked away, leaving Thomas standing alone in the rain. The following months were the hardest of Thomas's life. News of his termination spread quickly in their small town. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. His apartment lease wasn't renewed, forcing him to move to a smaller place on the edge of town. Job applications were met with polite rejections or more often silence. Thomas hit rock bottom on a cold winter night, sitting alone in his half-empty apartment, a bottle of whiskey his only companion. He stared at his phone, scrolling through old photos of himself in uniform, of friends who no longer called, of a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. His thumb hovered over Catherine's contact information, which he'd never deleted. What would he even say to her? Sorry seemed inadequate, an insult to what he'd put her through, and yet the need to make amends burned inside him. Instead of calling her, Thomas put down the bottle and opened his laptop. He began to type not a message to Catherine, but an application. to a community college program in social work. It wasn't a path he'd ever considered before, but something the general had said kept echoing in his mind. The chance to be better than he was. The next day, Thomas signed up for a volunteer position at a local youth center. The director was hesitant when she recognized his name but gave him a chance on a probationary basis. Working with kids who needed positive role models was humbling and rewarding in ways his police work had never been. 6 months after his termination, Thomas was walking home from the youth center when he spotted Catherine coming out of the local courthouse. She saw him too, and for a moment they both froze, uncertain. Thomas nodded a greeting but didn't approach. To his surprise, Catherine walked over to where he stood. "I heard you're working at the youth center now," she said. "Word travels fast," Thomas replied, suddenly self-conscious in his worn jeans and center t-shirt. "Small town." Catherine studied him. "The director says you're good with the kids." Thomas shrugged. "I'm trying to be useful." He paused, gathering his courage. "Catherine, I know it doesn't change anything, but I truly am sorry for what I did." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "You're right. It doesn't change what happened. But it matters that you understand why it was wrong." She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "My father said he saw you that day after your hearing." "He did. He said you thought I might learn from this." A small smile appeared on Catherine's face. "And have you?" Thomas thought about the past 6 months, about the long road from who he had been to who he was trying to become. "I'm learning," he said honestly. "Every day," Catherine nodded. "That's all any of us can do." She glanced at her watch. "I have to go. I'm due back in D.C. tomorrow." "You're not staying in town?" "Just visiting my parents. I was here testifying in a case." She took a step back. "Goodbye, Thomas." "Goodbye, Catherine." As he watched her walk away, Thomas felt something he hadn't expected. Not the attraction that had led to his downfall, but respect both for her strength and for the chance she and her father had given him. Not forgiveness exactly, but the opportunity to learn from his mistakes. Thomas turned toward home, the weight on his shoulders a little lighter than before. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in months, he believed he might find his way back to being someone he could be proud of, not despite his fall from grace, but because of what he'd learned on the way down. Sometimes, he thought, you had to lose everything to understand what really mattered. 2 years had passed since that rainy day when Thomas Reed's life had changed forever. The small town of Riverside looked the same. The same coffee shops, the same courthouse, the same police station he now walked past without a second glance. But Thomas was different. He sat on a bench in the town square watching people go about their day. Beside him was a worn leather portfolio containing his recently completed social work degree. At 34, he'd been the oldest in his graduating class, but that hadn't bothered him. If anything, his life experience, both good and bad, had given him an edge in understanding the complexities of human behavior. His phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor at the youth center. "Got the grant. Program approved. Meeting tomorrow at 9, Thomas smiled. The grant would fund their new initiative to pair at-risk teens with community mentors. It had been his idea, born from countless hours working with kids who, like him, had made mistakes and needed a second chance. As he tucked his phone away, a familiar police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Officer Diaz stepped out, now wearing the stripes of a sergeant. He spotted Thomas and walked over. "Thought that was you," Diaz said, sitting down beside him. "Heard you graduated," Thomas nodded. "Last week. Congratulations." Diaz seemed genuinely pleased. "So what's next? Private practice?" "Not yet. Staying at the youth center for now. We just got a grant for a new mentorship program." Diaz nodded approvingly. "You're good with those kids. Better than you ever were with a badge, if I'm being honest." The comment might have stung once, but now Thomas just laughed. "No argument here." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the town go by. Thomas had lost touch with most of his former colleagues after his termination, but Diaz had reached out occasionally, first with awkward check-ins and eventually with a genuine friendship that had surprised them both. "You hear about the changes at the department?" Diaz asked. Thomas shook his head. "New training protocols, anti-harassment policies with actual teeth, civilian oversight committee." Diaz gave him a significant look. "All spearheaded by our friend General Chen." Thomas raised his eyebrows. "Really?" "Yep. After what happened with you and his daughter, he went to the town council. Said if they didn't want a scandal and a lawsuit, they'd better make some changes. Diaz adjusted his badge. Between you and me, it was long overdue. How's the rank and file taking it? Some grumbling, of course. Change is hard, but most of us recognize it's making us better officers. Diaz stood up, straightening his uniform. Anyway, just wanted to say congrats on the degree. You earned it. Thanks, Diaz. As the sergeant walked back to his cruiser, Thomas felt a strange sense of closure. His mistake had led to positive change, not just for himself, but for the department and maybe the whole town. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it added meaning to the aftermath. The next morning, Thomas arrived early at the youth center, a converted warehouse on the edge of town. The place had become a second home over the past 2 years. The walls, once gray and institutional, were now covered in murals painted by the teens. Battered but comfortable furniture filled the common spaces, and a small kitchen provided snacks and simple meals for kids who might not get them elsewhere. Thomas was setting up the conference room for the grant meeting when Linda, the center's director, poked her head in. There you are, she said. Someone's here to see you. Thomas looked up, confused. The grant people aren't due for another hour. It's not them. Linda's expression was unreadable. It's someone named Catherine Chen. Thomas nearly dropped the folder he was holding. Catherine's here? Linda nodded. In my office. I can tell her you're busy if... No, Thomas said quickly. No, I'll see her. He followed Linda through the center, heart pounding in his chest. Why would Catherine be here after all this time? The last he'd heard. She was still working in Washington, D.C. Her brief visit to Riverside 2 years ago, the only time their paths had crossed since his termination. Linda's office was small but bright, with a window overlooking the center's basketball court. Catherine stood by that window watching a few early arriving teens shoot hoops. She wore a simple blue blazer over a white shirt, her hair shorter than Thomas remembered. She turned as he entered. Hello, Thomas, she said. Catherine. He managed to keep his voice steady. This is a surprise. Linda discreetly excused herself, closing the door behind her. Catherine gestured to the chair across from Linda's desk. Do you mind if we sit? Thomas nodded, taking the offered seat. Catherine sat in Linda's chair, her posture as perfect as he remembered. I heard about your degree, she said. Congratulations. Thank you, Thomas replied, still trying to understand why she was here. How did you hear about it? My father keeps tabs on you. At Thomas's surprised expression, she added, not in a creepy way. He just likes to know his investments are paying off. Investments? Catherine's lips curved in a small smile. Who do you think funded that grant you just got? Thomas stared at her, speechless. The grant had come through a military family support foundation. He'd never made the connection. Your mentorship program proposal was excellent, Catherine continued. Very thorough. The foundation was impressed. I don't understand, Thomas finally said. Why would your father want to help me after what I did? Catherine folded her hands on the desk. My father believes in accountability, but he also believes in redemption. He's been watching your progress. She paused. We both have. Thomas tried to process this information. For 2 years he'd been rebuilding his life, believing he was doing it all on his own. To learn that General Chen and Catherine had been watching, even helping from afar, was disorienting. I don't know what to say, he admitted. You don't need to say anything, Catherine replied. Your actions have said it for you. 2 years of consistent work with these kids. A degree earned while working full-time. A program designed to help others avoid the mistakes you made. She leaned back. That's why I'm here, actually. Oh? Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the desk. My firm is expanding its pro bono work. We're focusing on juvenile justice reform, and we need consultants with real-world experience. She nodded toward the card. We'd like you to consider a position. Thomas picked up the card, a sleek white rectangle with embossed lettering for a prestigious D.C. law firm. You want me to work for your firm? With our firm, Catherine corrected. As a consultant. Your experience, both as a former officer and as someone who's worked directly with at-risk youth, would be valuable to us. Thomas turned the card over in his hands. I don't know, Catherine. D.C. is a long way from here, and these kids would benefit from the programs your work could help create. She finished for him. Think bigger, Thomas. The youth center is important, but what if you could help shape policies that would benefit centers like this across the country? Put like that, the opportunity was tempting. Still, Thomas hesitated. Why me? There must be dozens of more qualified people. Catherine's expression softened slightly. Because you understand both sides. You know what it's like to have power and abuse it, and you know what it's like to lose everything and start over. She stood up. Just think about it. The position doesn't open until next month. Thomas stood as well. I will, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Catherine said. The work would be challenging, and you'd be facing people who know your history and may not be as willing to give second chances as my father and I are. I'm used to that, Thomas said with a wry smile. Catherine headed for the door, then paused. By the way, the town's police chief is retiring next month. I heard, Thomas said, uncertain where this was going. My father's been asked to consult on choosing a replacement. He's recommending Sergeant Diaz. Thomas felt a genuine smile spread across his face. Diaz would be excellent. We thought so too, Catherine said, her hand on the doorknob. Things change, Thomas. Sometimes for the better. She opened the door. Call me when you've made a decision about the position. After she left, Thomas stood in Linda's office for a long time, the business card still in his hand. Through the window, he could see more teens arriving at the center, laughing and talking as they headed inside. They trusted him now, looked up to him even. It had taken time and consistent effort to earn that trust. Could he do the same in Washington? Could his worst mistake ultimately lead to his greatest contribution? Thomas tucked the card into his pocket and headed out to greet the kids. He had a meeting to prepare for and a mentorship program to launch. But for the first time in years, he was also thinking about a future beyond Riverside. A future where the past wasn't forgotten, but was transformed into something useful, something good. As he walked through the center, high-fiving teens and answering questions, Thomas realized that what had seemed like an ending 2 years ago had actually been a beginning. And now another beginning waited if he was brave enough to take it. 1 year later, Thomas Reed stood at the podium in Riverside's community center, looking out at the crowd gathered for the town's first police accountability forum. The room was packed with faces both familiar and new, concerned citizens, current and former officers, community leaders, and a significant number of teenagers from the youth center. At the back of the room sat Catherine Chen, dressed in a simple gray suit, and beside her, Lieutenant General Robert Chen, who nodded encouragingly when he caught Thomas's eye. 3 years ago, Thomas began, his voice stronger than he felt. I stood on the other side of this issue. I was a police officer who abused my power because my ego was bruised. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I arrested a woman for refusing to date me using jaywalking as an excuse. I lost my badge, my reputation, and nearly lost my way completely. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Though most people in town knew his story, hearing it stated so bluntly was still jarring. What I did was wrong, Thomas continued. There's no justification, no excuse. But what came after? That's what I'm here to talk about today. Over the past year, Thomas had split his time between Riverside and Washington, D.C., where he consulted with Catherine's law firm on juvenile justice reform. The work had been challenging but rewarding, allowing him to translate his experiences into meaningful policy recommendations. Since my termination, Riverside has implemented some of the most progressive police accountability measures in the state, Thomas said, gesturing to a screen behind him where key statistics were displayed. Civilian complaints are down 40%. Use of force incidents have decreased by 35%. Officer retention is up. Public trust is growing. In the front row sat Chief Diaz, who had indeed been appointed to lead the department after the previous chief's retirement. He smiled slightly, pride evident in his expression. These aren't just numbers, Thomas continued. They represent real change in how our police serve our community. And it all started because one woman, his eyes found Catherine at the back of the room, had the courage to stand up against an abuse of power. And because her father, he nodded toward General Chen, had the vision to turn one incident into systemic change. Thomas stepped away from the podium to stand at the edge of the stage, dropping the formality of his prepared remarks. But that's not the end of the story, he said, his voice softer now, more personal. Because while policy changes are vital, they're not enough. We need to address the human element, the attitudes and behaviors that lead to abuses of power in the first place. He, gestured toward the youth center teens scattered throughout the audience. That's where programs like our Youth Mentorship Initiative come in. For the past year, we've been pairing at-risk teens with community mentors, including several police officers. Thomas smiled at a young boy sitting with Officer Patterson, one of the first cops to volunteer for the program. These relationships build trust and understanding on both sides. The kids learn that a badge doesn't make someone inherently good or bad. It's the person wearing it that matters. And the officers learn to see these young people as individuals with potential, not as problems to be managed. As Thomas continued his presentation, he felt a sense of surrealism. 3 years ago, he had been at his lowest point, drowning in shame and self-pity. Now he was standing before his community as an example not of failure, but of redemption, proof that people could change if given the chance and the tools to do so. After his speech, the forum broke into smaller discussion groups. Thomas found himself approached by a steady stream of people, some congratulating him on his work, others sharing their own stories of interactions with police, both positive and negative. As the crowd thinned, Catherine made her way to him, her father a step behind. "That was quite a speech," she said. Thomas shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I just spoke the truth." "The truth can be powerful when it's delivered well," General Chen remarked, extending his hand. "You've done good work this past year, Reed." "Thank you, sir." Thomas shook the offered hand. "But I wouldn't have had the opportunity without you and Catherine." "Don't sell yourself short," Catherine said. "We may have opened a door, but you walked through it on your own." She glanced around the community center where discussions were still ongoing. "This town has changed. For the better, I hope," Thomas replied. "Definitely for the better," a new voice joined in. Chief Diaz approached, his uniform crisp and his new chief's badge gleaming. "The department's morale is the highest it's been in years. Turns out officers prefer clear guidelines and accountability to the old way of doing things." General Chen nodded approvingly. "That's been my experience in the military as well. Good people want good structures." As they talked, Thomas noticed a young woman hovering nearby, clearly wanting to approach but hesitant. He recognized her as Lily, one of the teens from the youth center. "Excuse me," he said to the others, then gestured for Lily to join them. "Everyone, this is Lily Wong. She's one of our star participants at the center." Lily blushed at the introduction but stepped forward. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, addressing all of them but her eyes lingering on Catherine. "The mentorship program helped my brother stay out of trouble after our dad left, and—" She hesitated, then continued with determination. "I've decided I want to be a lawyer." "Like you, Miss Chen." Catherine's expression softened. "That's wonderful, Lily. It's a challenging path, but rewarding." "I know," Lily said. "Mr. Reed has been helping me research schools and scholarships." She looked at Thomas with evident admiration. "He says I have what it takes." "If Thomas says so, then I believe it," Catherine replied. "Perhaps when you're ready for law school, you could contact me. My firm offers internships." Lily's eyes widened. "Really, that would be amazing." After Lily left, practically floating with excitement, General Chen chuckled. "You found your calling, Reed." "It seems I have," Thomas agreed. Later that evening, as the forum wrapped up, Thomas found himself alone with Catherine in the now empty community center. They walked slowly toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space. "Your father seems pleased with how things have turned out," Thomas observed. "He is," Catherine said, "though he'd never admit it. I think he's a bit of a softy under all that military bearing. He likes a good redemption story," Thomas smiled. "And you? Are you pleased?" Catherine considered the question, her face thoughtful in the dim light. "I am. Not just with the policy changes and the youth program, but with you." She stopped walking to face him directly. "You could have let what happened destroy you. Instead, you built something meaningful from it." "I had help," Thomas reminded her. "Everyone needs help sometimes," Catherine said. "The important thing is what you do with it." They reached the doors and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The town square was peaceful, strung with lights that reflected off the small fountain at its center. "I've been offered a permanent position with your firm," Thomas said after a moment. "Director of Community Outreach for the Juvenile Justice Initiative." "I know," Catherine replied. "I recommended you for it." Thomas turned to her, surprised. "You did?" "Of course. You're the most qualified person I know for the role." She smiled. Does that mean you're accepting? Thomas nodded. I am. The youth center here is in good hands with Linda, and I can still consult on the mentorship program. He looked out at the town he'd called home his entire life. It's time for a new chapter. Washington will be different, Catherine warned. Challenging in ways Riverside never was. I'm counting on it, Thomas said. But I'll have a good guide, right? Catherine's smile widened slightly. I suppose you will. As they said their goodbyes, Thomas felt a sense of completion. The circle that had begun with his worst mistake was now closing with a new beginning. He would be working alongside the woman he had once wronged. Not as a romantic interest, but as a colleague and perhaps a friend. 3 years ago, Thomas Reed had been a cop who thought his badge gave him power over others. Now he understood that true power came from using your experiences, even the painful ones, to help others find their way. At the community center entrance, Catherine paused. You know, I never did thank you. Thank me? Thomas was confused. For what? For showing me that people can change, she said simply. In my line of work, it's easy to become cynical about human nature. You reminded me that growth is possible, even from the darkest moments. With that, she walked to her car, leaving Thomas standing under the stars, holding on to a truth that had saved him. Sometimes, the worst thing you do can lead to the best person you become.